Before we go to the next panel, I just want to correct an error. I think, as Blair said, of the plan, it's always in beta, so my opening remarks were also in beta. I made a terrible serious oversight in introducing everybody involved. I kept saying we, and I forgot to tell you that we meant me and my partner in crime at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, Carolyn Brandon, who you're going to hear from in just a second as she moderates the next panel, but I couldn't let us go any further without correcting that oversight. So without further ado, in fact, here is Carolyn Brandon to moderate the next panel. Thanks.
All right, so we are going to start first by hearing from the man responsible for helping develop the spectrum portion of the National Broadband Plan. And of course, I'm speaking of John Leibovitz, who is Deputy Bureau Chief in the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau at the FCC. And without further ado, John, please come to the podium and share your remarks. I am shutting the screen. Oh, I'm getting anxious hand signals not to close it. Is that okay?
That's fine.
All right, John, thank you.
I came with paper. Thanks for having me and for hosting the event. It's for people who were involved in the broadband plan, it was like a rite of passage going through it, and it's strange that it's 5 years later. I remember, I had the privilege of serving with Blair on the secret Obama pre-transition, the actual Obama transition, the FCC transition, and then all the transitions between those transitions. And I remember seeing the Blair's slideboard deck for the he said, we're going to do this national broadband plan, and he should have these organization charts that he had done in PowerPoint. And I was like, you got to be kidding. You're not going to hire 60 people to, do all these things. I can't believe you're doing that. And then that's what he did. He hired 60 people. And then the next thing was the seating chart on the 6th floor at the FCC, where he was rearranging entire bureaus to sit this, have all these people sit together. And I said, I can't believe you're going to do that. And that's what happened. And then the plan itself was another sort of the big thing. I can't believe that we actually produced that thing, but we did, and I was involved in a small part of it, the Spectrum chapter, Chapter 5, the only chapter. But I want to just talk about a little bit, just sort of about where that chapter came from, what predicated it, what the plan was, what happened, and sort of where we go from now. I think it's useful to start with where we were in 2009 when we started working on the plan. It's not obvious. It wasn't obvious at that time that spectrum would be something you would put into a national broadband plan. There had been some other broadband plans, and none of them had spectrum as part of them. We had just had, as a country, 2 very successful big spectrum auctions. There was, this thing called the iPhone 3G, but there wasn't, LTE hadn't been deployed yet. Verizon hadn't launched its LTE network. Voice minutes had been plateauing, if you looked at the data. Text messages was the big thing in data, but we all know they don't use a lot of data. CTIA, the trade association, didn't even report megabytes of usage at that time on an industry basis. So, it's a fair question. Why did we focus on spectrum? And I think it came down to fundamentally just a belief that, the internet would transform mobile communications the same way it had transformed fixed communications. And you could kind of see where it was going. I mean, there was obviously, there was this thing called 3G, and you could see sort of early broadband applications on mobile. And you could see early glimpses of social media. But yeah, I think fundamentally we were trying to think 5 to 10 years out. And how would the world look different if we were in a world where mobile connectivity was abundant rather than scarce? That was kind of the main framing question. And we also recognized that we were sort of in a hole. Once you frame it that way, we had to get out of a hole because, I think everyone knows the history of spectrum policy is delay, more delay. Everything takes a really long time, and then as long as you think it's going to take, it takes more time than that. One thing that I think was commonly cited during the plan is that we looked at how long it had taken to repurpose spectrum in the past, and it was usually a decade or more. It's not a task for the faint of heart. There's a lot of involved in doing it. And at the time, although we'd had these successful auctions, there was really no spectrum in the pipeline for future auctions, for future unlicensed uses. We saw that as a big challenge. So how do you, if you're trying to get more spectrum into the market, how do you do that quickly and not go through the usual 10-plus year wait to do that? So that brought us to the plan. I think the central, motivation was how do we do something much faster than the past. I think we've focused on two aspects. One was setting goals, which I think is a kind of a core part of any planning, is setting goals. And then the second was coming up with new mechanisms and ways to repurpose spectrum. So first we started with the goal. We came up with at the time, I think, a fairly audacious goal for the country of freeing up 500 megahertz in 10 years. I think that was, of course, there were people saying you should have, my joke was you should free up 4,000 megahertz below 3 gigahertz, but people always want more and more and more. But that was a very ambitious goal. When you look at sort of the swaths of spectrum had come online before that, it was almost a doubling of the amount of spectrum that would be available. And we had this sub goal of 300 megahertz in 5 years, which I'll talk about. That was a goal that sort of took shape looking at a lot of different factors, what was possible as well as what was desirable. And of course, we also worked with the administration, and it became the president's goal as well, which was hugely important because a lot of the spectrum is effectively under the control of the president. And then the second thing we did was we had a band-by-band plan for how to reach at least the interim 300 megahertz goal. Of course, that had an alphabet soup of bands. We had WCS, AWS, MSS, and this thing called the incentive auction, which was its own huge team, not really represented here today. And that team has kind of evolved and morphed. It's an even bigger team now. So moving to implementation, I think the thing that I'm most proud about as far as the broadband plan is what we were able to do in terms of implementing it, because it's been kind of a sustained process. We're just chipping away, and then punctuated by moments of, rapid apparent progress. So, a good example is AWS 3, where it was, a very long process. Many of the people here in the room were involved in that. And then all of a sudden this auction happens, and you start seeing, you're like getting graded on your work in real time, and it's very interesting to watch that. But, we tried to use all the tools we had traditionally. We tried to invent a few new ones. We weren't afraid to fail. I think we tried some things that quite obviously failed, somewhat, spectacularly. But, if you don't fail, you're not trying hard enough. And I think in those cases, we found other ways to kind of meet the shortfall through other bands and other techniques. So some of them, those are ongoing. I think AWS 3 is a really good example. Obviously, people talked about it. It was a big auction that ended after 300 plus rounds earlier this year. I think it's interesting for people to remember, if you go back 5 years, that band was mostly composed of two portions, the uplink and the downlink of the paired portion of the band. And the downlink was, I think people were saying, it was in the FCC's inventory. Some people have been saying we should get it to auction, but it needed to be paired to be valuable. Other people are saying, it's really not that valuable. They had other plans for how to use the band, other ideas about how the rules should be made that had some traction in the past. And then the uplink, of course, was in the federal inventory, and it was heavily used by a bunch of different federal systems. And so I think at the time, it wasn't obvious that you'd be able to kind of bring this spectrum to market. And of course, the plan talked about if you couldn't get the uplink, just do the downlink. But the reason we were able to get it to work was because of this huge multi-stakeholder process that evolved, with NTIA, with the administration, with the industry, with scores of unnamed federal workers who people don't really think of as spectrum, but there are these, there are people who work in Eglin Air Force Base who are right now, thinking about how are they going to retool the antennas on various systems to allow, for clearing several years from now. And that's, something that is a huge amount of work that, those people don't show up at these conferences and get congratulated, but they're part of the process. That was sort of an example of taking stuff that was partially in inventory and partially, in the government's control and finding ways to release it. We had other cases where there were bands that were essentially in private hands, and we just made the decision, we realized we had a choice. We could try to, take the spectrum back and auction it, which would be, years and years of litigation. Or we could keep it under existing rules that kept it sort of essentially took it out of the marketplace and kept it, from being usable for mobile broadband, or we could just liberalize it. And that was actually a big part of our plan was just straight liberalization of spectrum. I think there was some minor controversy in that whenever you liberalize, you always end up with some accusations of windfalls and other things. But at the end of the day, that for us, the guiding principle was get it out into the market, make it usable as fast as possible, because that's where the real payoff to the economy is. Of course, there was the incentive auction, which people have spoken a lot about, and I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on. It's an evolving story. It's not over yet. We're in the sort of, that has definitely been a case of peeling the onion from a big idea. We had to get a law passed. Were able to, we had rules that were voted last year, and now we're in the thick of how the intricacies of how is this auction actually going to work. It's complicated, but sometimes things that are really innovative, powerful, are complicated. That's just the nature of innovation. And that people said a lot of the same things about the first set of auctions in the early 90s. People had never seen a simultaneous multiple round auction before, and it scared some people, but it turned out to be a huge success. And I think the incentive auction, this has this incredibly skilled team with some of the world's leading experts on auctions working on it. And I think we're on track for early 2016, which is a few years later than what the plan said, which was 2013, but it's still remarkable when you consider how long the DTV transition took before that. I think it's pretty amazing. And then, we've also kind of zigged and zagged a little bit. So, this is the notion of the plan always being in beta. There were certain bands that came off the table. There were certain bands that came on the table. One of them was the 3.5 gigahertz band, which came out of a report from NTIA in 2010. It's a military band. It's used for very important military radar systems, primarily operate off the coast, not entirely. And so we've been looking at advanced ways of sharing essentially with the military, and they've been very cooperative working with us. Hopefully there'll be some things to share there soon. But we've also taken it as an opportunity to say, okay, if you're going to have this advanced sharing, which would be using essentially the cloud, if you will, to facilitate sharing between different kinds of users, that can also work on the commercial side as well. And one of the long-standing problems in Spectrum is how do you share between different types of commercial users, unlicensed, licensed, private networks, carrier networks. And I think there are some real opportunities in this band to try some new approaches that sort of blur some of those lines in a good way. And I will refrain from quoting the song, but I think that sort of once you can break down categories, when you have hard categories in the rules or in the regulations or in the laws, that's when you get these silos of different uses, which can be inefficient. And so I think what we're looking at there is, are there ways to kind of break down some of those silos? And that is potentially 150 megahertz that was not even mentioned in the plan, and could come online pretty soon. And then I should have to mention that we've also been hard at work on unlicensed spectrum. This is mostly the work of Julie Knapp and the team in OET, Office of Engineering and Technology. The 5 gigahertz band has been a major focus. We were able to relax some of the rules in 100 megahertz in the 5 gigahertz band last year. That will allow for more outdoor deployment and some more flexible deployment in that band. And then there's an ongoing effort to try to bring different stakeholders together in different parts of the band. It's very complicated to expand the band, essentially make it both larger and more contiguous to allow for the next generation of Wi-Fi and whatever other technology chooses to use that band, or that people choose to use in that band. I think, it's fair to say, what's the score? I think, how are we doing? We had 5 years, we had this goal of 300 megahertz in 5 years, 500 in 10 years. And I think, the interesting thing is we're actually pretty close to 300 megahertz in 5 years, which is, I think, fairly remarkable. Maybe we'll be a little less than a year behind that. The incentive auction will probably be the last piece of the puzzle in 2016. We've already, I'd say, we've already succeeded in getting and repurposing almost 150 megahertz in the last several years between AWS-3, between WCS band, and so on. When you look at the 3.5 gigahertz and the incentive auction, it's very likely, I think, even recognizing the fact the incentive auction, we don't know how much spectrum will come out of that, that we'll get to 300 megahertz. And then looking farther at the next goal of 10 years, 500 megahertz, if we succeed with the 5 gigahertz effort, that would take us all the way there. If the NTIA is looking at some other options, those would also be helpful as well. So I think there's definitely, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I think having the goal has been very helpful in focusing efforts to find different ways to reach it. So Blair just asked me to say a few things about the future. And so the one thing I would say is, one thing I've learned is it's very hard to make predictions. Things have turned out a little differently than we planned, but in some ways exactly as we planned. So can't even make a prediction about whether predictions will be predictable. I think we obviously need to keep looking at more spectrum and liberalizing, making more flexible, changing the rules. And that includes non-traditional bands. So obviously we're looking at spectrum and high-frequency bands right now with our Spectrum Frontiers effort, which is looking at upper microwave and millimeter wave spectrum, 24 gigahertz and above. This is spectrum that people mostly had sort of thought of as non-line, for backhaul or for point to multipoint, not for mobile use. There's a lot of energy around that. There's a lot of interest around the world in what we're doing. And we're at the stage now where we're collecting comments, trying to figure out how do we come up with a plan for that spectrum. And that will be potentially huge, but we don't really know what the technology holds there. Some people think it will be 5G. No one really knows exactly what 5G means. Our chairman likened it to a Picasso painting, where everyone looks at it and sees something different. We also have to look at, making rules more and more flexible. And this is a really hard thing to do in government, because when a lot of what happens with these rules is people are trying to solve a problem at a given point in time. They make certain assumptions. Those assumptions get frozen in time. Things move on, technology marches on, and the economy marches on, and at some point the rules seem stale, and you need to make them more flexible. And I think it's really important to ask all the time, whether some of the rules we have are, products of nature and of physics, or are they products of regulation. And as I said before, when you have regulatory categories, it's nice for lawyers who like to put things in categories, but it also leads to stovepiping, which can be very inefficient when at the end of the day we're talking about a shared physical medium. It's not, it's not, embedded in the laws of physics that you should have a table of allocations, which separates spectrum into federal and non-federal uses, or into, unlicensed or licensed uses. Those are human creations, and we have to ask, are they good? Are they working the way they should be? Or in some cases, good fences make good neighbors. In other cases, maybe we can get more efficiencies from combining things together. I think another important thing is we need to avoid creating a spectrum, what I call spectrum monoculture. So broadband is really important. I think a lot of people tend to think about spectrum in this room especially, as a medium for two-way communication and broadband, but there are many, many other uses of spectrum that go way beyond broadband. This is something you especially learn when you work with federal agencies who use spectrum in many, just radically different ways than we do. And it ranges from things like radars, sensors, which is incredibly important, part of the Internet of Things, which is gearing up, global positioning, telemetry, environmental sensing. There's just so many different facets of life that are served by the spectrum, and all these uses have to coexist and share. And my argument would be actually that not only do they have to coexist and share, it's the interplay between them, or what economists might call the complementarities between them, that creates huge value for the economy. So, having an iPhone or an Android phone that can talk over LTE is great. Having one that has a GPS function and maybe can measure my heart rate and do any number of other things and communicate that back over the broadband connection makes it even more valuable, and maybe transformationally valuable. And that's the kind of that's what I'm talking about. So we want to be careful in trying to relax or liberalize or change the spectrum rules, that we don't do it in a way that crowds out some of these other emerging uses. Everybody needs some room to grow. And then finally, I'll just say the last thing I've learned is it's really very helpful to set goals. The 500 megahertz goal has been enormously useful, I think, for us at the FCC, to the administration, to everybody involved in the process, and I think to the country. But I'd just like to suggest that we wait until the 10 years has passed before we set another goal, because it's tiring. So I'll stop there, and happy to talk more on the panel.
So let's see. I have a name tag, Mr. Brenner. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm Carolyn Brandon with the really teeny weeny little letters. I am thrilled to have such an august panel to talk about some of these issues and react to what we just heard. I am going to subscribe to Blair Levin's approach to introductions and just go very, very quickly. We are joined by Dean Brenner, who is Senior Vice President, Government Affairs at Qualcomm. Sitting next to him is Tom Power, who is SVP and General Counsel at CTIA, the Wireless Association. We are joined by Mary Brown, who is Senior Director for Technology and Spectrum Policy at Cisco. And last and certainly not least, we have John Kneuer, former Assistant Secretary for Communications and Information at NTIA, Principal and Founder of JKC Consulting. So to get us off and adhere to Blair's instructions to at least have some responsive commentary to the presenter, let me, and I know, Blair, we are not supposed to be offering qualitative judgment on the efficacy of the plan, but Mr. Leibovitz started with a referenced scoring. So let's just start and go down the panel. Dean, how would you rate or score the efficacy of the plan? Do you think it was bold enough? And the accomplishments thus far, is it going to get us where we need to be?
Oh, well, I'm on record when the plan came out, and all the Monday morning quarterbacks can look back. I said the plan was a fabulous document. I said that publicly, and I still think that. You have to have goals. You have to have a mixture of short-term and long-term goals. Some goals that are easy to achieve, some that are harder to achieve. But no one ever got anywhere without having a plan and having goals. So. No. I'll stand by that.
Okay, one thumbs up so far. Mr. Power.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just waiting for Blair to get it out of beta, and then we'll be really smoking. Yeah, terrific, and I think on execution as well too. I think we've had great sort of alignment between the various government agencies and between industry, and a lot of good news.
Mary?
Also a thumbs up for me. I think it focused the community, but the most important impactful change I saw was throughout the executive branch for the first time, really understanding what was happening on the commercial side and committing to help the commercial side out in finding more spectrum. So definitely a great job.
All right, John, anything negative to say, or are you going to?
That'll be nice. And I don't have any inclination to say anything negative. I think the holistic approach and the recognition that the use of spectrum-dependent technologies has so not just transformed the commercial environment, but the government's use of it as well. I think John's comments about flexibility and allowing the technology to lead on this, and recognizing that there's a place for licensed and unlicensed and government use and commercial use, and to the maximum extent possible, taking a flexible approach to let the spectrum get to where it's going to be most valuable, is sort of the core of this, and we're starting to see some of the fruits of that.
So Tom, if you don't mind, let me offer you a question just to, again, comply with Blair's guidance for this event, which is to take a real-world assessment as to what some of the drivers are for, and in particular, spectrum. What is it that you, as a representative of the entire industry, see happening out there that you think impacts the need for more spectrum? What do those drivers look like, and what do you think is the appropriate sort of stretch goal for how much more spectrum may be needed?
Well, you can slice it a couple different ways, and I know Mary and her company always have great statistics and all this stuff. Obviously, a lot of the industry is focused on mobile video, and we're, oh, thanks. I'm not good with the technology. And again, there are lots of different data points. I think it's a 1,200% increase in mobile video over the last 5 years, and projections that, within a few years, it's just going to be such a huge percentage of wireless data. And what you're seeing, as you often see in these circumstances, is sort of this cycle of innovation where the rollout of 4G LTE has led to more of a robust content creation, in the sense that it allows for a better consumer experience over larger devices, but that needs more broadband, but that generates more demand, which generates more content, and it just keeps going. Broadcast LTE now is becoming a piece of that. We're talking about 5G, which, as John says, we don't know what we mean, but we're talking about that. So you just sort of see this endless loop that's just growing. I don't know. I certainly agree. Goals are important, and I think the 500 megahertz goal from both the plan and the president's executive order was a very galvanizing event. But in some ways, these things are kind of a swag. You're trying to come up with a big round number to hit. But it's on the other hand, when you say what more do we need, it's sort of like saying how much electricity do you need. Do we have to cap it? I mean, you give me more and we'll do more with it. Limit it and we'll do less. And there are hard choices and a lot of hard work that goes into that. It's not easy, but we're not anywhere close to saying, okay, that's it. We don't need any more.
So, Dean, let me turn to you for a quick second. Given that the overall topic for this discussion is to discuss ways of getting the most out of spectrum, capacity and efficiency-wise, can you share some thoughts as to what you're seeing with chipsets and the development of devices geared towards maximizing what we can actually extract out of either current allocations or potentially future?
Oh, sure. So you just described, one of the main things that we do at Qualcomm, right? So we work with incredible urgency, both implementing all the things that John and the folks at the FCC, but also regulators all over the world do. And then, always trying to be several steps ahead. We're now working several generations ahead. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the task, so last year at Qualcomm, we sold 860 million chips. We're on our 5th generation of chip for LTE, and we're on our 3rd generation of actually integrating LTE with all the other technologies, which was quite a technical achievement when we did it. So maybe it would be best if I gave you sort of a virtual tour of our booth in Barcelona at the Mobile World Congress. So, and to call it a booth is a little bit of an understatement. It's got this giant superstructure. It's 2 stories, and it's got 20 conference rooms, and it has about 60 technology demonstrations. But let me just give you a tour of those demos. So the first one is what we call carrier aggregation. So as more spectrum is brought to market by regulators around the world, we're trying to combine different bands to build a fatter pipe. So we do that virtually. So we were showing 3x carrier aggregation, so taking 3 different blocks of spectrum, 40 megahertz, 20 up and 20 down in each block, and building one fat data pipe. And we were showing 600 megabytes per second to a cell phone, which is fantastic. Then you turn to your right and you saw what we call LTE Wi-Fi link aggregation. This is something that absolutely would have been unthinkable in 2009. So what we were doing is showing how through software at the base station, at the LTE base station, and in a phone, we could actually aggregate the data streams. We showed an access point and a base station being received simultaneously in the phone on different frequencies, but basically the bits are being combined, and we were showing this combined LTE Wi-Fi aggregation that was tremendous capacity and data rates. Then if you took 2 steps to the right from that, you could see LTE operating in unlicensed spectrum, 2 different flavors of it. One for the United States and other countries that have just basic transmit power restrictions, but don't have any sort of prescribed air interface or waveform. And the task there is to build something not unmodified LTE with lots of modifications to make sure that it can coexist with Wi-Fi, because of course we have a big self-interest in that, right? Because we have Wi-Fi integrated now into all of our chips. But then if you took 2 more steps to the right of that, you would actually see release 13 of LTE, which is on the drawing board, hasn't been standardized yet. And you would see a whole new LTE waveform that integrates the listen before talk capability that's actually mandated in Europe for LTE unlicensed. And you would see in both of those demonstrations, LTE in unlicensed coexisting beautifully with Wi-Fi, actually improving the Wi-Fi throughput as compared to Wi-Fi versus Wi-Fi. And some of that is because, again, we have our own self-interest in ensuring good coexistence. So, all of that is to say that with the same urgency that John and the folks at the FCC and Blair work with, all the stuff we talked about that day. Blair remembers Paul Jacobs and I came to have Chinese food with the team working on the National Broadband Plan. And, and Paul showed up sort of like a character out of Batman. He had all these devices, and every time someone asked a question, he would pull a different device out of his pocket. But, all of that stuff on our drawing board that back then, and then some, is what has been accomplished. So we just need to keep this thing going.
So let's dive into the core for a quick second, Mary. Two things, actually a two-part question, because we can't do straight up. Building a little bit on what Tom was observing in terms of just trends, can you reflect a little bit in terms of the great report you guys released, I guess, a month or so ago, in terms of global trends, which, may emphasize exactly what's also happening in the United States? And then separately, what are you seeing in terms of innovations at the core of the infrastructure that is complementary to some of the advances at the edge?
Yeah. So Cisco releases a mobile data demand study once a year in February, and every February we project 5 years out. So it's constantly rolling 5 years out. And the healthy news for the sector is demand continues to build. The bad news for John Leibovitz is we haven't seen any flattening out of the curve yet, John. So that's kind of a map of where we need to go with radio spectrum. So for example, last year in 2014, in the United States, we project that mobile data traffic was about 0.5 exabyte per month. Between 2018 and 2019, we're projecting that exabyte per month growth goes from 2.6 exabytes to 3.6 exabytes. So if you think about it this way, from 2018 to 2019, we're going to double the amount of traffic that we saw last year in the United States. So we either have to find more spectrum, we have to get incredibly more efficient, we've got to find new techniques to transmit this traffic because the demand is growing. And not unlike previous years, it's growing because of video, and more video. In addition to that, in addition to just that mobile licensed use of radio spectrum, another 7 exabytes of spectrum by 2019 will be in use by unlicensed technologies that are offloading mobile. So if you walk into your neighborhood coffee shop and your phone switches to Wi-Fi, for example, you are now not using the licensed spectrum, you're using unlicensed spectrum. So additional 7 megabytes is going to be, per month, is going to be offloaded onto unlicensed technologies such as Wi-Fi. That's huge. That's an enormous amount, which is why it's so important, as John reported earlier, that we find spectrum not just for licensed, but we also find it for unlicensed. And I think the final trend that I would point to, Carolyn, in terms of what's happening over the next 5 years is the growth in the Internet of Things, or the Internet of Everything, as we like to say at Cisco. We are going to become ever more intensive users of radio spectrum in the coming 5 years as we connect more things, which will be connected to the Internet wirelessly. So that is a huge sea change. It's not going to stimulate necessarily the traffic growth that broadband does, but it does stimulate the number of connections and the number of devices. And it raises important questions about the diversity of spectrum supply in order to fuel that demand, because not all of it needs to be long-distance, high-power mobile broadband, not all of it needs to be Wi-Fi. There may be other kinds of permutations of technologies that are going to come into play as we start down the road of building the Internet of Everything.
So, John, this is a perfect segue to you. Mary mentioned, this mix of spectrum from the government user's perspective. Obviously, intensive users of spectrum will continue to need it for lots of different purposes. Can you share some thoughts into, thinking around discussions that happen on exclusive and having to clear all eyeballs looking at government users versus a desire to develop realistic sharing mechanisms? Anything?
Sure. So we've gone through this multi-decade transition of how we think about transitioning spectrum from the federal government to non-government users. And we started in 1996, and we just directed them, handed over. And that's the end of the conversation. We found a fair amount of spectrum, and that launched the first spectrum auctions, and we had the beginning of our digital mobile economy. But we also realized that there were some limitations from the operational standpoint of the government. So we changed the law and said that they could be reimbursed. So we had the first version of the Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act, which said if you relocate and there's costs associated with that relocation, some of the auction revenue can come back to you, the government. And that answered part of the disincentive for the government. They weren't bearing an actual monetary cost, but they continued to bear an operational cost. You know, I've got thousands of man hours now being devoted to moving the spectrum. So in the revisions to the act that were part of the outgrowth of the plan, there was a recognition, well, maybe they can get additional capabilities, and they're not just replacing what they had, but they're taking advantage of this new technology. And that wasn't just an artifact of the relocation mechanism. In the first 5 gigahertz exercise that we undertook, that allowed for dynamic frequency selection, allowed for companies like Cisco and others to get access to the government spectrum band. The government was really incentivized to cooperate in that exercise because they were facing spectrum constraints. They were very interested in figuring out how do you have a sensing technology like a radar and a communications technology integrated into the same band. And if to the extent that the industry was figuring this out and they could be participants and help, they would get a benefit beyond just being reimbursed for the relocation, but they'd have difficult spectrum problems that they were struggling with solved as well. And that kind of brings us to where we are now. And there has been a constant searching for other ways that you can create incentives for the government. And people have talked an awful lot, so let's give them money. Let them get some of the spectrum revenue. You know, if DoD clears and the auction wildly outperforms like AWS, maybe they could have some money. I think that makes a lot of economic sense. I think it crashes headlong into the Constitution in the personage of the appropriations committees who say, Congress has the power of the purse, and that is actually us, this collection of individuals, and we're not going to give you guys you know, a spectrum slush fund. So I do think there are, because of all the things we're talking about, that spectrum is no longer just an either or of government use and commercial use, or it is broadband, or it is all of these things together. And the government desperately wants to engage in these new technologies, be a participant in this part of the economy for their own purposes and in their core missions and doing the things they do to serve the public. So I think the next phase is going to be, and this is building on John's talks about flexibility and liberalization, to the extent that federal agencies can find common interest with carriers who have licensed spectrum, and they can find a transaction where, for example, a government entity could get broad access to commercial spectrum. You know, we've got military bases in California that are the size of states on this side of the country, where the geography is completely under the control of the military. Perhaps they can get access to that spectrum in that geography, or are there spectrum adjacent bands of spectrum where by negotiating their own protocols and their own interference mitigation techniques, that perhaps they could find a way for a carrier to get access to government spectrum broadly across the country and the government to get spectrum the other way around. I think the challenge there is going to be to create processes where they can do that on their own initiative, their own arm's length, and register and file those agreements like two carriers with a partitioning or a disaggregation agreement could do it. That it doesn't have to be the product of one of these year-long, multi-year-long, decade-long rulemaking legislation processes, but let the parties figure out what their common interests are and negotiate their ways around that.
But those proceedings are oh so much fun, John. Come on. John Leibovitz, for a quick second here. In hearing about some of the descriptions of what's coming down the pike in terms of, device development, chipset development, what's happening with core equipment, How much of that future forward conversation fed into the thinking as you were developing the plan and establishing what you thought was realistically achievable over 5 years, 10 years? Or was it really more of, you guys did your own research and, sort of working with your own engineers and et cetera within the agency, given that you are the expert agency, that sort of external development and promise didn't necessarily impact the thinking?
I think it definitely impacted thinking. I mean, I think we were sort of trying to, when we came up with that goal, for example, we were looking at it from a few different angles. One was, what did we think was achievable as a stretch goal, given what we knew where we knew the opportunity areas were, and the other was, we're tuned into Mary's reports, and we're kind of counting on companies like Qualcomm and Cisco and others to keep the evolution of technology going. Look at more efficient ways to use spectrum, not just upgrading technology generation, but densification and other things. We actually put out a report at some point, which was admittedly a sort of high-level thought exercise, but was trying to look at some of the economic trade-offs because I think people talk about spectrum and well, in terms of getting efficiency out of the airwaves. People talk about spectrum, air interface or waveform and your network topology, but the other issue is price, and another way to, one of the key variables in those Cisco projections are, if there's scarcity, you can raise the price and limit the scarcity. It just means that probably a lot of things aren't happening in the economy that otherwise would be happening. So we looked at all those things, and I think some of it was just also analogizing to, when you look at the evolution of, dial-up to DSL to cable modem to fiber, then we heard about some of that before. There's these generational changes in technology that happen, and you assume those are going to happen, but that shouldn't stop you from, trying to give more runway for it to happen, and also, recognize that at the end of the day, flexibility is everybody's friend because we don't really know exactly what's going to happen in the future. Our job is to try to, take away impediments and create the predicate for investment, and then let the industry go do what it's going to do.
So this is an open question to anyone else on the panel, including you, John, and that is, you mentioned, John, in your opening remarks, a few of the bands that are sort of in the near term likely candidates to putting into the spectrum pipeline, whether it's unlicensed or licensed. For the panel, thoughts on what you consider to be the most important next tranches of spectrum, whether for sharing or exclusive use, are critical for the Beltway to focus on and get on the stick so that that 12-year process that it usually takes us to get our hands on usable spectrum is shortened?
Oh, well, so, boy, I never thought I would quote Sarah Palin, but let me just say all of it, right? So I also feel like quoting Ronald Reagan, right? So I paid 4 years of tuition at Georgetown, so I think I really paid for this microphone. But no, all the things that John talked about are all things that we're working feverishly on, right? So first of all, our business is global. So, we don't just look at what's going on here in isolation. We're looking at the global trends, and, there are now 40 bands that are specified in the standards for LTE, and there are now 300 different combinations for carrier aggregation, and I think we're just starting with 3x carrier aggregation, so it's almost infinite. So, our vision of 5G is not just the high band stuff that John talked about, although it's important. Our vision is low, medium, and high band. And we have a joke at Qualcomm that because of the Olympics, there's a lot of talk about how 2020, we have to launch 5G in 2020. But we have these internal meetings, and whenever the group on 5G starts talking about something that they want to do, our LTE folks say, oh, well, we can do that on LTE. So basically, we're going to get to 2020, and whatever technology we have, we're going to declare that to be 5G. So no, I think absolutely all of it is crucially important, and certainly there's no spectrum band that's being looked at in the United States that we're not working on how to implement quickly, rapid, as cheaply and as widely as possible.
Tom, Mary, any?
I don't think I'd isolate a specific band. I agree with everything Dean said. I mean, if you look at where we are today, obviously we just had the AWS-3 auction. We've got 3.5 coming along. We've got the incentive auction. The important thing is not to rest on our laurels because, as a couple folks have mentioned, it is 10 years from the time you identify a band to the time you get to deploy it. So we have to just keep moving on that. I think what's really important is that we have a continuation of the type of alignment I was talking about before, where we've got great folks at the FCC and great folks throughout the administration. And I will single a couple people out. Fred Moorfield and General Wheeler at DoD have really changed the way DoD approaches this stuff. And there are folks at DOJ and at the other agencies. DoD always gets the credit or the blame, depending on the subject. But it's maintaining that relationship and that collaboration and that hard work that you were talking about. It is really hard stuff. And John made a great point about the folks down at Eglin Air Force Base, to take that example, who are the folks who never get credit and are never seen. But when we were working on AWS-3, Eglin itself became a big issue because we knew the base wasn't moving and they weren't going to be able to get out of that band anytime soon because of the cost. So what do? Well, you start looking at things like power limits and which way the transmitters are pointing and all these really gnarly details, but they make a big difference. And in that auction, it meant the commercial licenses weren't going to be impaired in New Orleans or Atlanta, which was the original assumption from the DoD's perspective, at least. But because of a lot of hard work on DoD's side, you're able to shrink those down and make those licenses much more valuable, and then contribute to an auction that generates these crazy revenues and perhaps more importantly, frees up that spectrum for commercial use.
Mary, John?
So I have two answers. One, in the very short term, I think the work that the FCC is doing on the 3.5 band, and in particular the database sharing proposals there, as well as 5 gigahertz, portions of which are being evaluated for potential database sharing, is incredibly important. We are, in the sharing context, separate and apart from bands that are cleared for licensed spectrum, in the sharing context, pushing the envelope on the ways in which we share and how that's going to work is incredibly useful for us to do right now, to understand how far we can take that and what the limitations are, what the pitfalls are. So those 2 bands, I think, in the very short term are going to be very important to focus on. And then sort of in the longer term, I won't use the term 5G because I kind of agree with Dean. I'm very cynical on that term. It's going to be badly abused by every marketing department in the industry over the next couple of years. But let's think in terms of a paradigm shift, and let me just give you a little insight into Cisco's thinking on this. The internet, when Sandy Lerner and her husband wanted to communicate between 2 buildings at Stanford and invented the first router to do that, they were not thinking about wireless. It was a fixed connection to a fixed connection, and that's how the internet got built. It is now clear from the data that the internet is wireless at the edge and getting more wireless all the time. And the sad thing is, because we built the internet as a fixed infrastructure, there's a lot of complexity and overhead associated with putting wireless at the edge. So paradigm shift for the long haul, what if you re-architected this to take the overhead and the complexity out? And what would that mean in terms of our ability to better deal with the challenges that we're confronting from usage?
So, quick answer to the original question, and then just building on something that Mary just said. So John said, wait until the 10-year goal is up before we set another goal.
That was a joke.
No, but I don't think it is a joke. I think maybe that'll be the last goal that identifies X number of megahertz to move from one use to another. And it really builds on everything you were talking about flexibility and use of bands. It's rather than setting goals, quantifiable numbers of spectrum, it's really embedding the structure and institutions in place that spectrum will move freely from use to use as technology dictates, as consumers dictate, as business plans dictate. And it's something that is far removed from any sort of top-down analysis saying, well, we think in 5 years the better use of this spectrum will be X, so we need to start thinking about starting a proceeding to move it now. Let it go on its own. And I think we're getting to a place where that's going to start to happen. But just building a little bit on what Mary was just saying, and I know this is probably beyond protocol, Blair, that we're supposed to be focused on this, but sometimes in Washington it's remarkable how disconnected the primary thing people are talking about from the way things are moving in the real world. All of the conversation in the telecom space and the testimonies that are probably going on right now are a function of a belief that we don't have enough competition to allow market forces to protect consumers, and that we have to have a stronger, more centralized regulatory regime. That's all taking place at the same time that wireless really is breaking down every competitive barrier to the fixed carriers. There's always, people always comment and say, well, you can't talk about wireless as a substitution for wireline. They're different. What are you going to do with your 4K TV? The fact of the matter is today, right now, wireless is a key component of what goes on inside people's homes. The overwhelming number of devices in my home are wireless. Now, I'm providing the backhaul through a cable subscription, but consumer demand is something that people more and more want it to be mobile. So while fiber and cable may have a comparative advantage in pure speed, they've got a comparative disadvantage in that consumers want to take things everywhere. So whether it is consuming data on a tablet or on a phone, or wanting to have the same experience with your content, whether it's up on a big screen or when you go on vacation or go somewhere else, consumer demand and consumer behavior is making everything essentially wireless at some level or another in the ecosystem. So there's going to be more and more of that, and the lines between what is a fixed service and what is a mobile service essentially start to disappear. Just like every mobile service has fixed components in its architecture. You get to a cell tower and you get into the backbone somewhere. The distinction between where that handoff takes place starts to become immaterial from a consumer standpoint. And so just underscoring the importance of making sure the spectrum is available, but also realizing that it may not be those decisions and how it becomes available is going to start coming out of the hands of government and is going to be made by the market participants.
Can I just say one other quick thing about the plan, because it's just the pure genius of Blair and John and other folks, and that is the fact that there's no dissenting statement. There was no actual vote, right? It was just sort of presented.
We should do that on everything.
And in an era where, we're at this unbelievable partisan divide, all the partisan knives are out on both sides, there is just a plan. It is the United States plan. Everyone subscribed to it. There was no partisan controversy about it. That's a huge, huge fact.
On the other hand,
Now it's getting good.
no, I was just thinking something John said earlier about the challenge that regulators and policymakers face, which is they're making a decision based on what we know today and what we sort of assume about the future, or what we best predict about the future. And I think it was Yogi Berra who said the hardest thing to predict is the future. There's not many people listening. We've lost them.
I think it's an age issue.
Okay. Oh, right. Who?
They all came to a fork in the road and took it.
Right. But I would just, it is great vision in the plan and great work that's going on among all the companies and institutions that we've been talking about here. The U.S. has done a great job of just totally blasting past the rest of the world when it comes to LTE 4G deployment, and there are things that got us there, including exclusive licensing of cleared spectrum. So I think we don't want to lose sight of one of the important factors of the U.S. success.
Okay, so Jason Furman is going to be joining us, and for those of you who don't know him, he is with the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and I think he's going to be here at about 12:20 for a 12:30 presentation. In between, when we're done, and then there will be lunch outside for all of you to grab and eat and socialize, et cetera, and then be back in here at about 12:20. So, now that I've announced food is right around the corner, I do want to pose one last question to the panel, And if we have any urgent questions, I think we can take one or two from the audience. So last for the panel, and maybe we can start with you and go down the line. If there was a single spectrum-related policy that you think the next administration, whoever he or she may be, needs to have as his or her top priority, what would it be? John?
I have the least time to think about that. I think, well, kind of maybe extending some of the discussion before about where the opportunities are ahead. I think, I think there are definitely things to do in sort of the architecture way we think about spectrum, which I discussed, and John discussed some of those, and some big think ideas. But I also think if I actually just look practically at where the real opportunities are, I think that some of the tools we have today actually are pretty good tools, and the CSCA is one of them. It's the Enhanced Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act, and maybe it can be further enhanced in some ways, because I think as we have more practice with it, we realize there are some things that could be tweaked. But I think the most important thing is to move from a reactive stance to a proactive stance in terms of thinking about opportunities. And let me give an example. I think without getting too specific about specific bands, I think there are a number of systems, for example, in the government use, or a number of bands that are used by the government, and we have to remember they're used by multiple government agencies. They're already shared, so that's a thing that makes it even harder. But there are bands that are shared within the government and private sector actors, different ways, where there are legacy systems that are in those bands that perform extremely important missions. I mean, you don't want them to stop doing what they're doing. On the other hand, I think even the operators, when you talk to them of those systems, often will say, we could do it better, and what we lack the thing that most other people lack who want to do something better, which is money, or time, money, and permission to try something new. And I think there are some opportunities to get ahead of things for industry to work together with some of these government operators to understand what are their missions, what are they actually trying to do, are there technologies, is there cross-pollination of technologies that can make it more efficient, are there different architectures that can make it more efficient? How do we come up with an idea that gives the government user a better capability and still creates economic opportunity? So, when you have these big auctions, $40 billion could buy a lot of gear on the government side, even for DoD. And especially when you're talking about communications equipment and so forth. On the other hand, there are a lot of really hidden costs you have to work through. And I just think that is a multi-year effort to do that. You need to start with, sort of very, small, informal discussions and work your way through the process to real projects. And it may take alliances between commercial guys and, government contractors, for example. But there are some vehicles that are kind of emerging to do that. There's this consortium that DoD is launching to allow for commercial partnership with them to develop some of these. And I think if you take, sort of less from the side, well, we want this band because it's right next to the band we have, and, sort of think, okay, well, look out 10, 15 years, what would we like to have, what's in there now, how can we make everybody better off? I think there's some real opportunities, and, the challenge is that, the timelines are not necessarily aligned, that the government works on, sometimes 10, 20, 30-year timelines, and the industry has got a 5-year or less plan. So that's probably the biggest challenge, but also the biggest opportunity, I would say.
Dean?
Yeah, I agree with everything John said. I'm going to take this in a totally different direction, but in doing so, I'm going to not let the current folks off the hook. So this is an admonition not just for the next administration, and that is something we haven't talked about, which is FirstNet. So FirstNet has the money that was part of the legislation. The AWS-3 auction was a tremendous success. And, what a travesty it will be if FirstNet doesn't succeed in its mission, if FirstNet cannot succeed in getting a national public safety network up and running and proliferated, or, and finally solve the problem that was experienced on 9/11. So I think that, it's an unbelievable governance challenge because, we have this odd structure that was created, for, I'm sure, legitimate reasons, but we have a corporation with a board of directors, but under the auspices of the Commerce Department, and they're really trying to do things that a commercial entity would do, but within the bureaucratic difficulties of the government procurement process. And then they have this terrible problem of all these mini little states, localities, and towns that have their own even funding, some from the stimulus bill, and they've got to put this all together. And it will be a travesty if this does not work out.
When you talk about specific policies, my mind just always wanders back to this issue of agency incentives and this idea, as John was alluding to, the proposal, can we do an incentive auction for agencies, for example? But obviously John put his finger on it, which is whether it's appropriators or OMB, they want DOD to have every penny that DOD needs, but not a penny more. And so you can't have a slush fund, as John said. I do wonder whether there's some way to continue to work on that, where you might be able to address the problem that John Leibovitz puts his finger on, which is getting agencies to be more proactive from the get-go when designing systems. So we run into this problem where there are satellites operating on certain bands, and the satellite is designed to run for decades, and it can only rely on that one band, and you can't do a truck roll to a satellite to fix it, or if you did, you would have to get there between 2 and 6 on Thursday, and there's nobody there to. But we're seeing technological advances where now software-defined satellite, that kind of thing, where you might be able to be more proactive if the funding is there. But it's tough to get over the obstacles that John identified. Bigger picture, I would simply say I just hope that the last few years, where we have seen, I think, a change in approach from a lot of the agencies and just a shared understanding of, as General Wheeler would say, we defend this country because we defend, among other things, the economic freedom and productivity and the quality of life and freedoms that we have here. And not to overstate it, but Spectrum's a big part of that, and they totally get that. And so I think just continuing that sort of enlightened attitude and collaboration with industry is the most important thing the next administration can further.
Thank you.
Hear, hear, and I would say I completely agree with everything that Tom said, a lot of what John said, and I think the Guthrie-Masui bill that's out there looking at ways in which we can incentivize federal agencies to make the transition is good thought leadership. It's not enough, but it's a start. The other thing I would say, it's not so much a policy, but it's really an obligation on the part of those of us in industry. And I just want to go back to where Dean started us off with a walk through the Qualcomm booth at Mobile World Congress. We have a requirement on us, or a burden on us, to make sure we're good spectrum stewards and make sure that the technologies we're developing are going to meet the needs of this sharing environment. And without getting into the weeds, I mean, there is a dispute now in industry, and I know Cisco and Qualcomm are on very different sides of this, concerning LTE unlicensed and whether that is going to be a helpful addition, that technology will be a helpful addition in its current form to the unlicensed band, or will harm existing transmitters there. I don't want to get into the weeds. I just want to say there's some real issues in the standards bodies that our colleagues in industry are going to need to be wrestling with as we move toward this ever-intensive use of spectrum.
So I'll just get deep.
John,
Yeah,
Handy?
go for it.
I think an artifact of our current spectrum policy is that everybody sitting up here is a lawyer. And maybe 10 years from now, when you bring together a group of people who are making decisions or representing people who are trying to figure out how to get spectrum to its higher and best use, we'd all be engineers. So that should be the objective.
Here, here. All right, we do not have time for questions. I think if anybody has a question for any of the speakers, please feel free to mob them out here in the atrium. Lunch is outside, and please come back at about 12:25 and get in your seats for Jason Furman. Thank you.